One of the most fascinating rock and roll conspiracy theories had to do with the death of John Lennon. Personally, I remember his death, and it was probably the most devastating moment I had. Being very young with John Kennedy, I remember a sense of sadness with Kennedy's death, but when Lennon died, it seemed like I'd lost my best friend because even though I didn't know John, his music seemed to speak to me and to move me. And the question was, why would John Lennon be killed in 1980? He had left his recording basically behind to become a house husband. And when you look back at the 70s, when John recorded Somewhere in New York City, he was at his radical best, and that was under the Nixon White House, who had tried to deport him. However, in 1980, this is the John Lennon who was happy watching the wheels go by. From Double Fantasy, a father proud of his son. He didn't appear to be a political threat. So why, at this time, would John Lennon's life be taken? We know that the Carter administration had given John and Yoko safe refuge in New York, and John felt very much at peace by walking up the street, talking to the many onlookers, and he felt like he had really nothing to protect him. However, one deranged gunman, Mark David Chapman, had made his way from Hawaii to stalk John Lennon and kill him. Now, what would be his reason? He claimed that he wanted to protect the young minds from John Lennon's poisonous theories of imagine that there's no heaven. And for that reason, Mark David Chapman sat by the door of the Dakota and waited on a vigil in which he would be the killer of the man of peace, John Lennon. He befriended a number of Lennon's groupie friends who always were there saying hello to John, and I suppose that John thought that another onlooker in the crowd with people he knew would be perfectly safe. As a matter of fact, on the day he died, the album Double Fantasy was pushed in front of him by Chapman, and Lennon signed it. There's a photograph of Mark David Chapman smiling widely as Lennon gave his signature, and it looked like that Chapman may have changed his mind. But he didn't. He came back and he waited. And later that night, when John and Yoko left the limo to walk into the Dakota, John hears the name Lennon. And as he turns around, 5 shots are fired, and John Lennon was struck down. Lying in a pool of blood, the doorman comes up and he says, "Do you know what you've done? You've shot John Lennon." And Mark David Chapman calmly puts the gun down, takes out his copy of Catcher in the Rye, and starts to read until the police show up. Now, a number of people remember the movie The Manchurian Candidate, where you had a killer who was brainwashed, that when he saw a playing card, he went out to take his target. During the making of the film Manchurian Candidate, the Cold War idea of mind control of assassins became something the American public could believe. And when the film came out, the idea that a playing card could trigger some post-hypnotic suggestion to send a killer out to do the work of the government. Well, was Mark David Chapman a mindless Manchurian Candidate? Some people believe that the book The Catcher in the Rye was the target. In the film Conspiracy Theory, Mel Gibson had an obsession by collecting hundreds of copies of the same book. So, John Lennon's death, why 1980? Think of this. When Reagan was elected president, what other member of the counterculture was left that if he became politically active, could he go out and raise large concerts of hundreds of thousands of people to preach what was wrong with the political theory of the time? Was he a threat? We may never know. Or maybe it was just a strange coincidence that in 1980, before the Iran-Contra hearings, that John Lennon was silenced. The death of a great poet and the death of a friend of an entire generation. This is Gary Patterson. Thanks for walking with me on the dark side. You know, you may think some of these stories are fact and some are fiction, but one thing for certain, you'll never listen to your music exactly the same way again.